Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to do a very quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so yes, you can watch it back or share it later with colleagues if you wish. It gets posted to our YouTube channel, so you can head over there. But as you've registered, this will also be emailed to you in the next day or so. So that will come over shortly. So welcome. This is a brand new webinar series. We're really excited. So this time we are looking at maximizing integrations to augment existing efforts in proactive cybersecurity. And on the agenda, we've got an overview on the potential integrations, what issue trackers can be chosen, how to utilize them, and the value that they bring, of course. We will then have some live examples in IriusRisk to demonstrate some of the additional steps you can take to integrate even further. And then you may be wondering by now who our speakers are. Well, many of you will have seen our head of professional services, James Rabe, before. James delivered the Diagramit sessions previously and will be on hand for these next 3 episodes. He's responsible for designing and implementing threat modeling for our varied customer base. And joining James is a longtime valued friend of IriusRisk, Jason Nelson. And Jason is the founder and principal consultant of Necessary Security. And if you've not yet checked them out, we highly recommend you do so. Necessary Security is a consulting services organization for enterprise companies focused on threat modeling, cloud security architecture, program design, and training. So thank you both very much for being here to share your wisdom. Very eager to crack on and hear what you have to say. So shall we begin?
Absolutely. Let's get started.
Thanks, Claire.
All right. So as we talk through some of the many integrations we're going to cover in this series, obviously today is going to be focused squarely on issue trackers. But specifically within, threat modeling is primarily design phase activities. So as we think about many of the plan and the build and some of the other integrations we have available to us, IriusRisk enables us to take and translate those business requirements into design requirements. And then as we're talking about what can go wrong and the potential risk mitigation activities around those design and build requirements, we can start to sync those into IriusRisk very early. And this is where something like having the extensible API that IriusRisk has with nearly, I think Claire was like 600 something endpoints, something ridiculous. We have the ability to pull in much of that data into IriusRisk, and then also egress much of that data into other potential integrations, which we'll cover at length. Like I said, the primary focus of today is going to be issue trackers, but we're also going to be going through things like GRC tools, code repos, IDP integrations, other value point connections where you, especially given the scale of the enterprise, without those integrations, you're running into so much manual work, and we're not meeting users where they need to be. Jason, anything else you want to add here?
Yeah, thanks, James. So some of you may have already been following the series or multiple series that IriusRisk has put out. James himself has done a build it, and that kind of shows this is how you get IriusRisk tooling up and running. John Taylor, I think, just wrapped up on his series about rolling out a program for threat modeling. And this series that we're doing here is kind of going to be the zoomed in focus on both of those. So not just this are the components of the program, but specifically with the integrations, the value that brings. Because in a lot of cases, people have tried to just focus on the process. How do I threat model? Or I bought a tool and that's going to solve all my threat modeling problems and challenges. But we're going to really focus on not just on the technical integrations into tooling from IriusRisk to other tools that do different things, as James just explained, but we're going to kind of highlight the value of the business integration, the process integration that these technical tooling integrations will provide. So it'll take you from not just I've threat modeled something and created a list, but I now can integrate my work into existing processes in your company that then will add value and make your process integrated into other programs, thus adding value instead of just being another thing. So We'll add a lot more detail around that throughout today's conversation and the following, but I just wanted to give that context to everybody so they're thinking about that as they're listening to the conversation.
Perfect. Thanks, Jason. Claire, let's jump onto that next slide here. So as we go through, and obviously the first question we're going to ask here is, okay, why utilize issue trackers to begin with? And I think, we think about the additional benefits, and then we're going to jump into IriusRisk in a little bit and kind of see what type of information can be captured by working with. Obviously, we have different items we can sync in. So inside of IriusRisk, you can sync things like the threat, you can sync the weakness, you can sync the countermeasure, and you'll be able to see all the different pieces of information that are in each of those different types of items, objects inside of IriusRisk. But we think about, like, why would I want to do that inside of a tool, right? On any given threat model, you might have anywhere from 10 to several hundred, depending on the scope of that model. If we're not utilizing the issue tracker sync in that process, you're going to find users are downloading reports which are static and really out of date the moment a user starts working with them. And then we have to hand off that singular document to another individual, or we're moving it to a singular shared source. The value of this, of course, by switching to the more dynamic issue tracker integration issue tracker link, is that now I have a live feed from my issue tracker into IriusRisk. So as I update either the link inside of IriusRisk, that link is then updating the ticket inside of Jira, inside of ServiceNow, inside of CA Rally, inside of Azure DevOps. But it's actually updating it bi-directionally. So if I had comments in one location, it's syncing those to the other direction. If I'm updating the status inside of the issue tracker, it's then updating the status inside of IriusRisk, showing that item has been closed out and fully mitigated. Also tracking things like security artifacts, where if I have to provide documentation on has this been verified, so not only has it been implemented, but I also have some kind of artifact which demonstrates yes, it has been successfully implemented and tested and verified by a member of our team. So that next level integration there with the issue tracker just lets you meet developers where they are, which I think is one of the more important items, instead of requiring them to come find yet another piece of software to do their day-to-day activities.
Yeah, and just to add a different spin on that bidirectional updating is critical in a couple different stops in the SDLC, because as James introed, threat modeling is typically done in the design phase. And so this is where your business requirements have come in. They've been translated into technical controls. Threat modeling does the review of the design and gives feedback. And that's where the tickets are created. They're broken down into tasks and put into these issue trackers. That bidirectional updating is useful for a couple different reasons. Obviously, the developers need to know and get status of, am I done? The project managers need to know, how are we tracking and making progress? Further down the line, risk and controls, your compliance teams, audit teams, they're going to need to see this. And you can actually build out into the risk and controls program with this type of integration. Am I done? What work was done? And is it good enough? Without having to do the manual meetings typically done at most companies at the end of the process. And that creation of artifacts, the tickets are acting as artifacts when things are closed, and the detail inside of IriusRisk captures the state. So as people are listening to this, it's not just the tools that James mentioned of integrating into them, it's the data, the artifacts that they produce, and how you can use that to integrate and provide value to multiple players in your SDLC. I just want to highlight that.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great point. Claire, anything else we have here? Any other questions from the audience? I see a couple of chat messages here.
No questions as yet. I just love the fact that we can at IriusRisk integrate with these 4 tools in particular, because it is awesome if you've got a team that don't necessarily want to go over into the threat modeling tool. It's not maybe part of their role to do that, and that's okay. So they can stay in Jira, but they're still getting all of that information back and forth. So it's just something that looking forward to us showing in a little while.
Yeah, and I think we're probably robbing a little bit from our next slide. So go ahead and transition over. But and I do want to stress, the business value of not having static work, right? So the business value of teams integrate, and this sounds silly, but I work with so many customers that are still downloading and using a manual spreadsheet to go, and they're sending it off to teams downstream, and they're asking them to update, and then there's another person who's responsible for coming back in, and they're manually inputting this information. The business value of not having to do manual effort like updating tickets and things like that from a interview someone else, and then I'm going to input that new data in here and I'm capturing a response from them. I don't think I can understate the value of that integration enough. And Jason, maybe add more to that. I know you've seen this at a much larger scale with several organizations now.
No, absolutely. The value of these integrations and time savings is, especially at scale, is huge. And I think I covered that. I just did a talk at ThreatModCon, and that was a big focus of my presentation, was about the time and cost savings where threat modeling integrations along the SDLC can bring. So conceptually, people need to think about, as they're threat modeling and they have these tooling integrations, and there'll be additional types of tools that we're going to talk about throughout the series, but today is about like issue trackers and things like that. Specifically in issue trackers, think about how much time is wasted and the lack of detail that you have to look back and analyze like a value stream if you don't have at the beginning of the process, so the business requirements phase, all the way through to production deployment and all the SDLC stops in between. If you had a single ticket that you can start to say, okay, I started here, transitioned here, did the work, kicked back for whatever reason, started, moved on, and for all those steps along the way, we're able to say, this is how long it actually took me and who did what steps in between. That value for any business process is really, really important, because now when people start pointing fingers saying, oh, security is slowing us down again, you can say, actually, here's where the slowdowns occur. We're meeting our SLA, SLO. Further on down the line, when you get away from just the tickets and things like that, you can actually demonstrate, because I've done this several times, I'm accelerating through my phase because I'm reusing content I've already done. So, and you can demonstrate all that through these issue trackers and IriusRisk having reusable content now.
And I think that the idea of measuring the value of threat modeling, I think that's always kind of at the forefront of those teams, because threat modeling is always perceived as, say, it slows me down. I've got to do one more thing to build this application. What have you found that teams will, I mean, obviously you kind of mentioned a couple, leading and lagging indicators here. Have you found that organizations, what's the catalyst for adoption on those? Is it always a later thing we have to go back and defend why we're doing it? Or do you find that the programs that develop those metrics as a part of a startup, have a little bit more momentum carrying the program forward? What have you seen be successful, Jason?
It depends on the size of the company and regulated or unregulated, because obviously smaller companies that are unregulated may not have the burden to have a mandate to do this. So they're doing it because they understand that, hey, security is important and we need to do something to put this in. But when you start putting in metrics and value stream and other things like that, it gets a little heavy. And so the justification is a laggard, because they're usually the ones that, hey, let's get on and do this. But then when things start to get slow or things like that, there's no ability to measure, so they point to the thing that is newest. But that's usually where you get the need to have a tracking mechanism like a issue tracker system. The
So
larger, sorry, man.
No, I was just going to say, or add, Jason, it sounds like it may also help with like accountability, because perhaps with a newer tool or software, if you're taking your time to get familiar with something, then maybe there are reasons for that slowdown. But if you're meeting teams where they are, then there's accountability, there's hopefully improved prioritization. Is that type of thing that you've seen, or does it vary? Sorry to butt in. I thought now was a time to ask.
No, it's a great point. The accountability, because now when you threat model and you start to identify the points, and you're now tracking them in either IriusRisk or these issue trackers, it's a very clear statement of this is an action and this is what needs to be done. And the clock has started once that ticket's created. And then there's an assignment. So that creates, if the culture supports it, an accountability structure. If it's just, yes, there's tickets and there's millions of tickets, who cares? It's not going to change the culture just with that. There's other things you can do to change the culture and enforce accountability. So that's how that happens. The larger companies already have process that mandates and demands the accountability perspective. So it's easier from that perspective to integrate that, but it's more difficult to get the new program started, which is, it's kind of reverse of the smaller companies. But that's why this program integration is the real key point to accelerate and get adoption.
And I think that as we were talking about, like, there's always before and after of threat modeling, and obviously you want to demonstrate the value of, even if you're purchasing a tool or if you're integrating any type of tool into your threat modeling process. I think the value of aggregating data from the issue tracker is that just about everybody's using an issue tracker. So even if you're not tracking it today, you're not tracking the time it takes you, time and stage for your SDLC process, you at least have the historic data that you can go back and look at and determine how much time we were spending even during design phase, how much time we were spending on remediating some of those actions later. And then you can go back and you can aggregate the historic time to demonstrate the value of threat modeling integrated into the new process, because you'll be able to see the picture before and the picture today. Because I know one of the hardest things about demonstrating the delta value in any new process or new product is no one's tracking this data beforehand, because there wasn't a requirement for it, right? And if you're not tracking any data and I'm not measuring it, how do I quantify if this thing's valuable or not? I mean, it feels like it's valuable, and that's great until you have to defend how much time we're spending on it. And then it's very difficult to defend, gut or anecdotal. 65,000 companies worldwide using Jira. That gives us a ton of data that we can look at beforehand. But I think that to your point earlier about compliance versus non-compliance, or regulated versus non-regulated companies, I know that even in some of the ones that are regulated, where there's very much a culture difference between threat modeling as a checkbox versus threat modeling as a culture. Because the checkbox companies have terrible threat modeling programs. They're just looking to get through an exercise, toss up a whiteboard, and then move on. Those that choose to integrate it, I know that's obviously the point of this series, but let's say just integrate it into their culture and into their business process, and they take this seriously, that's where you see the actual returns. But then you have the companies that are non-regulated that have chosen to threat model because they recognize the value. And I think it'd be really interesting to kind of see what those integration points look like and how they're different. And obviously that's probably another series we could talk through later, but well, cool. Anything else? Go ahead, sorry, Jason.
I think once we get past this series, this issue tracker one, and move on to the next one or next couple ones, there's going to be other integrations where we can demonstrate the business value, like when we talk about architecture review boards, or when we talk about code and reference patterns and things like that. Those are going to be the really interesting things for people to look forward to in the series. Today, the integration with the issue trackers, we definitely have to talk about value streams, and we have to talk about just the integration into the business processes as the value, because I don't think it'd be underestimated. I think this is the ideal place to start, because without this data, you're really not going to be able to do some of the other ones meaningfully.
And so many companies already have issue tracker tools, so you may as well augment what you're doing, incorporate, weave them together, whatever the case may be. You've both kind of mentioned about regulation and compliance to some degree. So is it fair to say that by using issue tracker integration that it helps with that kind of audit trail, because then it kind of again is linking between IriusRisk as a threat modeling tool, the activities happening in Jira, and by that bi-directional workflow, you've got a full picture of what has happened when, by whom, how maybe that architecture has changed, whether it went through a review process, whether it was implemented. So it feels like another positive step for demonstrating compliance, even if, like James, you're saying, maybe it's not needed right now, but it's coming. At least then you have that in the pipeline, if you will, ready for if that legislation is coming for you.
Yeah, and I think like in regulated industries, I think there are three key considerations. One is being able to say what you're doing, right, through policies and procedures, being able to actually do it, so making sure we've enabled and trained and we have the right technology in place to do those things. And then lastly, and maybe the most important, is being able to actually demonstrate we've done what we said we did, right? Because even if I do 1 and 2 well, if there's no audit history and there's no record of me demonstrating to an external auditor or to internal audit that I'm doing what I said I was doing, I've missed the boat. Because even if I have a really well designed plan and I'm executing it well, but there's no evidence of it, I'm still going to get the ding, right? I'm still going to get that mark on the audit where they go, yeah, well, they said they're doing it, but there's no artifacts, there's no evidence of it. And I think you need each one of those to set up that regulated industry and demonstrate to an external auditor that saying we're doing it, and then we're providing evidence that we're doing it. And this is going to provide that end-to-end integration. And I know, obviously, Jason, that's your bread and butter. I mean, being successful at scale in the heavily regulated industry. So talk more about that.
Yeah, I just want to create a delineation just so the audience and whoever sees this later understands where we're making comments on and where we're not making comments on. When we're talking about the artifacts in audit and governance or regulatory reviews, the system of truth, system of authority, however you want to refer to it, some companies have a process and a definition of what that means. So I want to make sure that we say, if you choose to use IriusRisk as that, it's storing your artifacts and all the content, make sure you've built out a process around that can meet the obligation for your internal audit or regulator. I have kept things away from my toolings and put them into things that are institutionalized in the company, because they have DR, they have multi-location architecture design. They have all those things that need to be in order to be a system of truth. So I don't think we're going to talk about it today. So I just want to create that bright line of, we're not talking about that. But what we are talking about is using the integration trackers and having that bi-directional communication with IriusRisk creates the visibility and the high fidelity of data that can be used in other processes and systems of truth. And that is the value of this integration. So when audit, when second line defense, when a regulator comes there, you can easily provide the content without having to produce an engineer in front of one of these types of groups. And that is invaluable in itself from a review process perspective. You almost never want to put engineers in front of auditors. You want it to be a very polished, clean report. Here you go. This is what you've asked for. This is what I've delivered. Tooling, you don't want anybody really digging around in your tooling. It creates other IAM burdens. It creates other management overhead. It's easier to create these API integrations because most other teams have a tool. Let's say your compliance teams, they have Archer, they have other tools. And we'll talk about those things, I think, later. But the integrations into the other business functions and producing the traceability with the issue trackers is the first step, because now that artifact itself gives a timeline, it gives approvals, a tacit approval, not an official approval, because if something is a hard gate, you're going to have an artifact that demonstrates an email or some sort of process that was performed. But these things can be embedded in the tickets and therefore contain the artifact, and it nicely wraps everything up to make it very, very simple for these types of reviews. So I think that's at a high level and quick and dirty, that's the real business value of using these issue trackers integrated with IriusRisk.
Perfect. I think that's a good segue. I know we're right on here, about 5 minutes till the end here. So Claire, do we want to kick over and actually do the show what this looks like inside of IriusRisk?
I will stop sharing.
All righty. So
I don't think I can do a drum roll on my headset, but I'll try.
all right. So what we're seeing here, and let me know if you can't see my screen, just double check here.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So inside of IriusRisk, inside of our control panel, we have our issue tracker settings. Now, a few versions ago, we introduced something called issue tracker profiles, which is where you have the ability to centrally manage your issue tracker profile. So you can see here, I've got a couple standard ones that I've created, and we'll jump over to our integrated. You can see right here, I'm defining a default profile for my tenant. I can also go through and define a different profile. And a profile is just a mixture of some issue tracker with some board, with some set of issue level configuration. So I could be defining it as a bug. I could be defining it as a user story in ADO, in ServiceNow, in CA Rally, whatever my preference is going to be there. But that unique combination is now going to become an issue tracker profile, centrally managed here, so that my teams can just grab it and deploy it without needing to know any of the API tokens, any of the credentials, any of the things that we may not want to share outside of a couple centralized administrators. So I can define that for my tenant, or I can go in and I can change. You'll see as I open this up, I'm defining our tenant, our project key, our usernames, our tokens. I'm then going through and setting the user as the reporter, which lets me differentiate between a service account versus, myself, James Rabe, is submitting an issue tracker ticket into this team. I can also link issues. I can create them as relates, as blockers, different types. And this is going to be some of the Jira specific configurations, setting it up as a task. And you can see as I hit this drop down, I have other types of tickets on this board. So I've got one that's an epic, which represents a threat model. I've got some that are threats for my countermeasures for tasks, other different types. And then I've got my issue workflow states. And the value of these are going to be that as it syncs from issue tracker down to IriusRisk, as I move from a proposed state into an in progress or into a done state, it's going to sync those issue trackers back over to IriusRisk. I can discuss my issue priorities, my different custom field values. All of that is just basic configuration level items and really not terribly interesting, right? This is the setup. But once we get into actually kind of how does this work, you see I've got a basic threat model, EC2 instance, an RDS, and then I have an S3 bucket. If I kick over into threats and countermeasures now, I'll be able to select one of these countermeasures, and I can go in here and select create issue. It'll let me pick which of my issue tracker profiles I want to use. And right now I have this set up to be my default. I could have set up any of these to be the default specifically for this project because it pertains to a certain team or a certain business unit. We'll just go ahead and grab this one here for the integrated. I'll select create issue. And you can see it's going to assign a ticket here. So created successfully. And then I can actually open this up and go directly to that ticket inside my Jira instance. You can see it's grabbed the countermeasure name as the title. It's grabbed the description, any URLs I have inside of there, any of the standards that might apply, as well as some of the references, right? And it's got a lot of different stuff in here. And then I can also start assigning the priority, the assignees, the labels, any of the other fields in here that I may want to configure. So it's grabbed this directly from IriusRisk and it's ported it over into Jira. And then obviously as I go through and update these and move this to in progress and then move this over to a done, this status will now sync down into IriusRisk at some interval set by your team, either a 5-minute sync, a 1-minute sync, depending on what your preference is. So giving you plenty of options. And I know that brings us right up to time. So I'll go ahead and stop that share. But any questions maybe before I do that from the audience, and it's for today.
Nothing has come through. A few people confirmed they could see your screen, so thank you.
Perfect.
So
Thanks,
I
Josh.
assume it was very clear. So speak now if you have any questions. I have got to save the dates for the next one. I just quickly reshare my screen. So date for the diary, 19th of November. We're looking at GRC as a topic. So note that down. And then as soon as we've got that live for you to register for, we will, of course, share that in the usual ways, email, on our social accounts. So make sure you give us a follow and we'll share that shortly. Brill. Well, thank you both very much for sharing your expertise and kicking off episode 1. Looking forward to the next couple as well. And yeah, we will see you all on another webinar very soon.